It's Friday, time for your history update. So clearly I'm sitting in my office today. It's also Valentine's Day. So happy Valentine's Day, happy Friday. So today for your history brief, I'm gonna talk about somebody in IU history you've probably never heard of, but I think he's got a great story and I wanna share it. So his name is Willis Tyler and I got a picture of him and you'll see this picture of him quite a bit. This is actually from Monroe County History Center, a blog post that they did about him. And Willis Tyler was one of the early African-American students at IU, and I'll tell you about why he also connects back to the military veteran side here in a second. So he was born near Bedford, Indiana, and came to IU when he was 16 years old. And by then, both of his parents had passed away. And so we're not exactly sure when he came to Bloomington, but he had an aunt that was a servant at Wiley House. And then he was connected with the Eagleson family, which was one of the early African-American families in the community that was connected with the university as well. And so he seemed to be working with or possibly even living with them at different points. And so some point he got to Bloomington and was doing all that and came to IU. And he came here at the age of 16. And then when the Spanish-American War broke out, he joined one of the African-American units from Indiana that served in the war. And Indiana was one of only a few states that was allowed to send African-American units to serve in the war. And there's an interesting piece in that unit's history that talks about him, and it says, Corporal Willis O Tyler of Bloomington, formerly a barber and part-time student at the State University, conducted a class in Spanish for the black volunteers as preparation for duty in Cuba, which was expected to be their assignment in the spring. So I had the registrar look and see. He didn't take Spanish classes at IU. So not real sure where he learned Spanish from during this time, but he somehow did, enough that he was teaching it. It's also noteworthy that he was a corporal, because you have to remember African Americans weren't allowed to be officers at that point. So that leadership in just the short time that he was in really kind of says how much he was a leader and kind of where he was headed with that. So he serves in the Spanish-American War, comes back to IU, gets involved with oratory. So oratorical contests were a huge thing at that time. Big deal. When IU would compete every year in the state oratorical contest. There's literally pages in the yearbook dedicated to the oratorical contest. That was the big competition of the day. Well, the 1901 yearbook, there is only one African American in the entire yearbook that's pictured that I can find. And who is it? It's Willis Tyler. There's an entire page dedicated to him. Why? Because he won the state oratorical contest for college students that year. Beat out Franklin College and Purdue and all the other schools. And he was the first African American to win that contest. And they talk a lot in here about the speech that he gave and how it raised, the other schools started applauding. There were Civil War veterans that were there that started applauding, and then the other schools started. And the IU students were actually afraid to applaud because they thought it would skew the judges, or they'd get blamed for trying to skew the judges. But it was such a big deal. He wins. Big hero back on campus, big man on campus sort of thing. Goes to the regional competition, places fourth at the regional competition. And a lot of IU folks at the time talked about that being possibly due to some racism and some other issues. But anyway, he was the first one to win. He wasn't the first African American to compete in that contest. We actually had previous African American students from IU that had competed in it, at least one. But he was the first one to win it. So he goes on to graduate from IU in 1902 and goes to Harvard Law School. And at Harvard Law School, the Indiana Daily Student continues to sort of track him. And in 1907, they ran an article in the IDS about the fact that he's about to graduate from Harvard and that he is receiving the highest honors ever given to an African-American student at Harvard in 1907 when he's graduating. And they go back and talk about how he won the state oratorical contest and everything else in this article. So he goes on to practice law in Illinois and then moves to California, and he becomes one of the early civil rights lawyers in California. As near as I can tell, he did get married, but he didn't have any children. And so I think some of his legacy may have been lost over time, and we're not quite as aware of him as we could be had he had children and people to sort of carry that on. But I hope to one day do a little more research on him and learn a little more about him. I know he's buried in Southern California, and I know there's some history of his work with the NAACP out in Southern California, but I don't know a whole lot about it. Maybe that's a future research topic for some aspiring student. But in the meantime, I think it's cool to know he was probably, as near as we can tell, and historically probably the first African-American veteran that we had that attended IU. And so that's Willis Tyler. That's your history update for this week, and we'll see you next week.